There is widespread condemnation from politicians following a night of violence in Montreal. Protesters clashed with riot police, cars burned and windows smashed in the chaos. Pro-Palestinian and anti-NATO demonstrations turned violent Friday night as NATO delegates meet for the annual assembly. The Prime Minister denounced what he called acts of anti-Semitism, a claim protesters deny.
During the Freedom Convoy protests, the Canadian government froze bank accounts and invoked the Emergencies Act. The reason? They claimed it was necessary to stop a threat to democracy. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great. Thank you so much. Now back to the video. Fast forward to today, where pro-Palestinian protesters are lighting cars on fire in Montreal, yet these are labeled peaceful. The numbers don't lie, and in this video, we'll break down the startling statistics that expose this glaring double standard. The streets of Montreal erupted in chaos as pro-Palestinian protesters took their demonstration to a shocking new level. What started as a rally quickly spiraled into a scene of destruction that left onlookers stunned. Masked individuals, their faces hidden from view, began setting cars ablaze in an alarming display of violence. The air filled with thick black smoke as vehicles became impromptu infernos. Flames licked the sky, casting an eerie glow over the gathering crowd.
Windows were smashed and 2 cars set on fire during a protest against a NATO summit being held in Montreal. Police made 3 arrests for assault on officers and obstruction of police work. Police say objects were thrown, and around 6:30 p.m. the SPVM used chemical irritants to disperse the crowd. The demonstration was organized by the group Divest for Palestine, demanding Canada withdrawal from NATO. Around 300 delegates are in Montreal for a summit focused on Ukraine, climate change, and the future of NATO.
The acrid smell of burning rubber and melting metal hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just property damage, it was a full-scale assault on public safety. Yet, in the face of this mayhem, Prime Minister Trudeau's response was baffling. He labeled these actions as part of a peaceful protest. The disconnect between his words and the reality on the ground couldn't be more stark. How could anyone describe the deliberate torching of cars as peaceful? As if the burning vehicles weren't enough, the protesters' chants added another layer of menace to the scene. Their voices rose in unison, calling for violence against perceived enemies. The aggressive rhetoric echoed through the streets, sending chills down the spines of bystanders caught in the crossfire of this so-called peaceful demonstration. Footage from the scene tells a story that words alone can't capture.
Lawful peaceful protests can be co-opted by anarchists who have other agendas. Those agendas were quite apparent by the activities of that mob yesterday, and those behaviors are unacceptable, and we can condemn them.
This protest last night, though, turned violent quite quickly. Montreal police say demonstrators were throwing objects at police, lighting vehicles on fire, breaking windows. They were smashing the windows of businesses as well as the windows of the Palais des Congrès, where the NATO meeting is taking place, the convention center there in Montreal.
Masked figures dart between burning cars, their silhouettes illuminated by the flames. Some protesters hurl firecrackers at police, the explosions adding to the cacophony of destruction. It's a far cry from any reasonable definition of peaceful assembly. As the situation escalated, onlookers held their breath. Surely the authorities would step in to restore order and protect public safety. The anticipation built as riot police arrived on the scene. Would they take decisive action to quell the violence? In a twist that left many scratching their heads, the police response was surprisingly limited. Despite the clear and present danger posed by the burning vehicles and aggressive protesters, law enforcement's intervention was muted at best. A few canisters of tear gas were deployed, but the overall approach seemed hesitant and restrained. This tepid reaction raises serious questions about the consistency of law enforcement's approach to different types of protests. How can we reconcile such a hands-off attitude towards blatant acts of violence and destruction with the heavy-handed tactics used in other demonstrations?
And speaking of that, you alluded to it, we saw anti-Israel protests in Canada. Now, they descended into chaos at the weekend and actually turned violent. Clearly, Clearly, these protests were filled with hate and anti-Semitism, and yet the leader of Canada was out there dancing and taking selfies, and it took him hours upon hours to even release a statement about what was witnessed.
As the smoke clears and the embers cool, we're left to wonder, what exactly constitutes peaceful protest in Canada today? And more importantly, how does this compare to the treatment of other recent protests that didn't involve setting cars on fire? You might think setting cars ablaze would trigger a severe government crackdown, but what if I told you that a protest without a single burning vehicle led to the most extreme response in recent Canadian history? The Freedom Convoy saga is about to expose a shocking double standard that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about protest politics in Canada. Let's rewind to the Freedom Convoy protests in Ottawa. No flames, no masked figures, just truckers peacefully demonstrating against COVID-19 mandates. They parked their big rigs, waved flags, and yes, honked their horns. It was loud, but it wasn't violent. Yet the government's response? It was like they were facing an invading army. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau pulled out the big guns. On February 14, 2022, he did something that hadn't been done since 1970. He invoked the Emergencies Act. This gave the government powers usually reserved for wartime. They could freeze bank accounts, ban travel to protest zones, and even prohibit public assembly. All this for a bunch of truckers honking horns. Trudeau claimed it was necessary to restore order. He talked about the potential for violence, mentioning a small group with firearms at a border crossing protest. But in Ottawa, the most dangerous weapons were bouncy castles and hot tubs. The real threat, according to the government, was to the economy. Those trucks were blocking trade routes, and apparently that's scarier than burning cars in Montreal. Now, let's compare. On one side, we have truckers honking horns and blocking roads. On the other, masked protesters setting cars on fire and chanting violent slogans. Guess which one Trudeau called a peaceful protest? If you said the one with the burning cars, congratulations. You've cracked the code of Canadian protest politics. The contrast is mind-boggling. Peaceful truckers faced frozen bank accounts and emergency powers. Violent protesters got a pat on the back and a keep up the good work from the Prime Minister. It's like we're living in a bizarro world where setting things on fire is peaceful, but honking horns is a national emergency. This double standard isn't just unfair, it's dangerous. It sends a clear message. The government's response to your protest depends on whether they agree with your cause. Disagree with the government? Prepare for the full force of the law? Agree with them? Well, apparently you can burn a few cars and still be called peaceful. As we watch this tale of two protests unfold, one question burns brighter than those Montreal car fires. What does this mean for the future of free speech and assembly in Canada? The double standard in Canada's protest responses is shocking. We've seen peaceful truckers face frozen bank accounts and emergency powers, while violent protesters setting cars ablaze are labeled peaceful. This glaring inconsistency raises serious questions about the future of free speech and assembly in Canada. Legal experts warn that using the Emergencies Act for the Freedom Convoy could set a dangerous precedent. It might lower the bar for declaring public order emergencies, potentially chilling legitimate protests. The government's actions send a clear message. Your protest's treatment depends on whether they agree with your cause. This isn't just unfair. It's a threat to democracy. Canada needs consistent application of the law regardless of political views. Otherwise, we risk a future where some voices are silenced while others can burn cities with impunity. It's time for Canadians to demand equal treatment under the law before it's too late.